Well, good evening, everyone. Just make a little adjustment here to my screen. Just can't tell until you go live what everything looks like. But it's good to see you all tonight. Glad you can all come in. We're getting a few more dropping in even as we speak, which is great. We're going to be in Daniel chapter 11 tonight. I thought I'd come on just a few minutes early and let you know, first of all, that Carolyn is going to be able to come home tomorrow. That's a real answer to prayer. She'll be headed home from the hospital. She's been in since, I think, Saturday. So that's a long stay in hospital, but she's gotten good reports back from tests that were done. So they just got a couple of more tests to go before tomorrow, and they said she'd be able to go home. So that's a real blessing. And thank you all for praying for her. She appreciates it greatly. I can tell you that. Had a chance to see her on Monday, and she was in good spirits too. So that's all. That's a good report to be able to give. Also, Brother Ron T had his couple of surgeries, minor surgeries on him, his one on his face, one on his back, and he's back home. It was just an outpatient thing, but he's doing well too. So we're glad to hear that. Good reports from both, and that's a real blessing. Well, tonight we're going to be looking again at this great vision that Daniel had. It's the final vision in the book of Daniel, and it covers 3 chapters of the book. And so tonight we're going to be covering in large part material that we have seen before in the book, and I'm going to be referring you to some of those sections just to remind you of where we are, because it's easy when you're looking at prophetical things to sort of get lost in the exchange. But as I've mentioned to you, the book of Daniel is separate visions that repeat or enhance material previously given. Daniel has seen everything that we know of right up to the end. He saw the Ancient of Days sit. So we know that he's seen fully through to the end. But the other visions give more information, more detail about certain parts of that. And that's what we're getting mostly tonight. So we're going to try to get through the first 29 verses. As I said, we've covered a lot of this before, so I'll be reminding you of those things, and hopefully everyone can catch up, and then next week we can move along a little bit further in this chapter. So we're in the 11th chapter of the book of Daniel, and I'm going to get there myself. I've been jumping around to try to get everything set up so I can show you these things tonight. So let's look in Daniel chapter 11, beginning verse 1, and we'll read through verse 4. This is a bit of discussion here about the overthrow of Persia to the Grecians, and a lot of this section is then going to talk about the period after Alexander the Great. So let's read beginning verse 1. Also, I, in the first year of Darius the Mede, even I stood to confirm and to strengthen him. And now will I show thee the truth. Behold, there shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia, and the 4th shall be far richer than they all. And by his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Grecia. And a mighty king shall stand up and shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will. And when he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken and shall be divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, not to his posterity, nor according to his dominion which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be plucked up, even for others beside those. And this discussion is a recounting of what was still future for Daniel, because Alexander the Great had not come onto the scene. This was prophecy when it was given to Daniel, that that the Medes and the Persians, their kingdom, would have an end date, and that following them would rise Grecia. And he mentions there the first year of Darius the Mede. And I think here we're talking about that Darius that ruled and reigned with Cyrus in conjunction for 3 years. Remember how we talked about that, he came to that kingdom in 538. And so standing with Darius was the King of Kings, right? The King of Kings is talking here. He's the one who stood to confirm and to strengthen Darius, and also, of course, subsequently following that, Cyrus. And Cyrus, it was that one that was chosen to be the one to issue the decree to bring the nation of Israel back into their land and to restore Jerusalem, to rebuild the city and the wall of the city, and also to rebuild the temple. So this was a promise of Scripture, and that decree by Cyrus in 538 was the sounding board. That was the promise that all of the prophets were referring to. Cyrus being that man who was named 200 years before his birth, that he would be the one who would do this. That's how you know the prophecies are valid and true. Well, in verse 1, we see that God was there to strengthen him. This goes along with everything we've been talking about and discussing in all of our lessons, that it's God who sets up and who causes kingdoms to flourish and causes kingdoms to be plucked up, that his purposes are being fulfilled through the kingdoms of this world. One day, these kingdoms, the kingdoms of this earth, will become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ. And of course, Jesus will rule and reign on this earth, as the Bible tells us, for 1,000 years. And then will come the judgment. So we know that it is God who's working to set these rulers up. He prophesied about Cyrus before his birth. And so now we're reading that he was there with Darius the Mede, strengthening him and confirming the kingdom into his and into Cyrus's hand. He says in verse 2, "And now will I show thee a truth. Behold, there shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia, and the 4th shall be far richer than they all. And by his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Grecia." Now, of course, we know, because these prophecies have now been fulfilled, that Alexander the Great and the nation of Greece was to be the next great kingdom to spread across the world. And the conquest of Alexander the Great was to be very swift, and his kingdom also, his kingship rather, to be very short indeed. But nevertheless, we see here that it was the last king who was far richer than all of the others, and that he stirred up all against Grecia. And it's very interesting how we have other references to these same events in other passages. And I mentioned to you that I wanted to bring those up to sort of remind you of the scriptures that we've seen. The first great reference to it is in chapter 2. And I'll get you to hearken back, at least in your mind, to think of that vision that Nebuchadnezzar had. Remember, he saw the great image with the head of gold, the shoulders and arms of silver, the belly of brass, and the legs of iron. Remember how he saw those 4 elements, and then with the iron legs, toes which were iron mingled with clay. And that image talks about the fullness of time. So we have from Nebuchadnezzar, who was the head of gold, all the way down through the end of time, the last of the kingdoms on this earth, the iron mingled with clay, not binding itself together, not the strength of the iron legs, which represented Rome, but iron mingled with clay. And we're in that time. We most certainly are. We're in the time of the toes of this great image. The time is far spent. We are most definitely in the end of days. As Paul said, he was in the end of days. We know this because the Messiah has already come, who is Jesus Christ. He has already been cut off, as Daniel said. His life was taken from the earth, but not for his own sins, but for the sins of the world. So you see, God is looking after the world. He so loved the world that he sent his only begotten Son. So anyway, we're looking back to chapter 2. As I said, we see this dream exposed. And then verses 37 through 45 of that chapter, we don't have time to read them. I'll entrust you to read them again to remind yourself of them. He mentions that Nebuchadnezzar was the head of gold. And of course, Babylon as a kingdom lasted from 606 to 538. And you recall how it fell in a night to Darius and to his general Cyrus, who stormed the city by coming down the river and was not even really contested. He took the capital without even firing a shot, virtually. You recall this was the night of the hand writing on the wall. Many tikul upharsin, which means you are weighed in the balances and found wanting. And Belteshazzar, his life was taken from the earth that night, and the reign of the Medes and Persians took over. They are that breast and arms of silver in Nebuchadnezzar's vision. So we see this whole kingdom represented in the vision by the arms and breast of silver in this great statue. The Medo-Persian Empire lasted from about 538 to around 330, the time, obviously, of Alexander the Great, whom we're talking about here, who defeated Darius III. And Darius III had a much greater army than Alexander. Alexander had about 38,000, I think it was, in his army. Darius III had 1 million people in his army. But you see, God had determined that Alexander was to rule, that he was to take the kingdom. And so he did. God sets up the rulers, and Alexander the Great was set up in 538 or in 606 BC. And so we see the kingdom falling to Alexander in 333 BC, or around 333 to 330. Two great battles there with Darius. Darius was routed in both of them, running from battle. He ran faster than his troops. He was the first one off the field. That's a great thing for your king to be, right? The last one off the field. But nevertheless, it's the way it was. God had taken from him the confidence that he was meant to rule. In fact, his rule was over in about 333 BC. So thus enters in that great belly and thighs of brass, which was the Greek rule over the world. And you recall that Alexander the Great, who was the belly and thighs of brass, to that great statue, uh, was also to have a very short reign. It mentions it here in our passage in Daniel 11. It says, "And a mighty king shall stand up." This we're talking about Alexander the Great, and that shall rule with great dominion. Up until this time, there was no king that ruled the amount of territory that Alexander the Great ruled, and he shall do according to his will. So his will was being done. He was running across the known countryside. It says, "And when he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken." And thus it was with Alexander the Great, that he had no sooner stood up than he was fallen again, and so ended his kingdom. Alexander the Great, if we say he took over in 333 BC, he died in 324. So it wasn't a great and long rule, was it? And in his place, 4 kings stood up. So imagine that kingdom of Grecia covering the world, and at the death of Alexander the Great, it being carved into 4 pieces. And that's exactly what happened. Now, I mentioned there were other dreams that had these truths placed in them. Daniel chapter 7 is another great vision which tells us, and again, it gives us a little more detail about this breaking up of Alexander's kingdom into parts. So if we look at this, there were 4 great beasts that came up out of the sea. Do you remember that? Recorded in Daniel chapter 7, verses 3 through 7. So these great beasts were coming up out of the sea. Of course, the sea was turbulent, and this is talking about the world, the peoples of the earth were reckoned as the sea in this image, in this vision. And out of the sea came up these great beasts, and the beasts were kingdoms. And the first, he said, was like a lion, and it had eagle's wings. That was Nebuchadnezzar, or Babylon. He was the first great kingdom which God had set up over the world. And the second was like a bear, if you recall. This is the Medo-Persian Empire. And it talks about 2 great leaders there, Darius and Cyrus, of course, Cyrus the Great. Neither was really had the majesty, ever held that majesty that Nebuchadnezzar had, but nevertheless, they were given the kingdom and allowed to rule. And it talks about them expanding their kingdoms. The third, it said, was like a leopard. This is verse 6. So if you want to see Alexander the Great in this vision, you'll find him here in verse 6. It says that which it had, the third was like a leopard, which had upon it, the back of it, 4 wings of a fowl. And this talks about the swiftness with which Alexander the Great took the kingdom. He just took it with such deliberate force. He was, before you know it, he was the king of the known world. He defeated Darius III. I read you a little story about that, and I'll read it again to you here. Before the Greeks conquered Persia, Darius III assembled the largest army ever created to try to stop the progress over the Greeks. It was over 1 million men from 40 different nations. And he was still defeated by Alexander, who had no money and only 35,000 men in the Battle of Arbela. The Greeks, under the leadership of Alexander the Great, defeated Persian armies in Macedonia in 333 BC, which defeat, of course, marks the fall of the Medo-Persian Empire and the rise of the Grecian Empire. It says here, going on from that vision, the beast also had 4 heads. Now, this signifies, as I mentioned, when the great horn was broken, which was Alexander the Great, 4 came up in its place. And these were those various and sundry kingdoms, which were literally the generals of Alexander the Great. They took over the rule and the reign and divided the kingdom up amongst themselves. So in a sense, it was still the Grecian Empire, but it was the Grecian Empire now divided into four segments. There was, of course, the Antipater, who ruled in Greece to Philippi. We know Philippi, of course, from the Bible, the place where Paul preached. And then there's Ptolemy, another of his generals who ruled from Egypt into Palestine, or into what is modern day Israel. There was a lot of disagreement and fighting between Ptolemy and the Seleucid king. The Seleucids were Syria, Babylon, Medio-Persia, so they were in that area, and they had a lot of battles back and forth over that small area of Palestine. And it was just because the two kingdoms were going back and forth over them. And lastly was Antigonus. He was in one of the generals who took Asia Minor to Philippi. So you can see how it was divided up. There was one in the east, one in the west, in the north, and in the south. And of course, the south would have been Egypt and what would have been Israel. But as I mentioned, it was disputed land. And it's interesting here, isn't it, in talking about the four kingdoms into which the Grecian kingdom would be divided. Those men were the heads over them, so they represent that third beast along the line, which was that one that and in Nebuchadnezzar's vision, the bellies and thigh of brass. So those represent Grecia, and Grecia broken up into these four kingdoms. Now, why are they significant? Well, they're significant for many reasons. Let's talk about Daniel's vision in chapter 8, verse 1, because again, we're covering the same ground again. Daniel has another vision. He sees a different subject, but talking about the same period of time, the same kings. So in Daniel here, we're going to talk about that breast and arms of silver that he saw in Daniel chapter 2. It said, shall arise another inferior to thee. And Daniel saw this in his vision as a ram and a he-goat. So the ram representing the Medo-Persians with two notable horns, Darius and Cyrus. And of course, on the other hand, he saw the he-goat pushing with a great horn. Obviously, the great horn is Alexander the Great, and pushing forward and going ahead. Daniel saw the he-goat in his dream, and in that dream, it says, after this I beheld, and lo, another. That's the one from chapter 7. So the leopard, which also represents that kingdom. Now the he-goat attacked the ram, and he came close to the ram, and he was moved with choler against the ram, and he smote him. Interesting, isn't it, that the he-goat being Alexander the Great in the Grecian kingdom. It says here that a mighty king shall stand up, that shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will. And he was stirred up by the Persian king, Darius III, that we see from verse 2 of our text here in Daniel 11. And by his strength and through his riches shall he stir up against the realm of Grecia. But he stirred them up to his own demise, didn't he? Because Alexander the Great came running, flying across the earth, and with all of his money, with all of his troops, he still could not fend off God's plan for this earth. And that was to set up Alexander, and then later to divide his kingdom into four parts, which he did. And it says, there was no power in the ram to stand before the he-goat. This is from back in chapter 8. And there was none that could deliver the ram out of his hand, and no one stood up for the Medo-Persians. It was just allowed to happen, and it did happen. And so away they went. Now, also in Daniel chapter 8, we have the vision of the little horn. So if you're going to go back and read this, this is in Daniel 8, verses 23 through 25, talking about that particular time. And in that section, you go back to verse 20, remember the ram and were the Medes and the Persians, and the he-goat with the great horn between its eyes was Greece, and that great horn was Alexander the Great. And we're told here that a little horn was going to rise up. It arises in the latter time of their kingdoms. Here we're talking about the four kingdoms, Alexander's kingdom of Greece, which was divided. So at the end of their kingdoms and the end of their time to rule, and remember, they are overcome by Rome. Rome takes over as the great ruler of the earth, according to God's plan and to fulfill his purposes. So we read here that there arises in the latter time of their kingdom a little horn. And this is talking about the end of the Seleucid Empire. And I don't know how far to go in this, because I'm keeping an eye on the time, and I know we're coming up on half past. And I hope I haven't left you behind. I know I've been speaking quickly, and I've been referring you back to Daniel, but I want you to see how all of these visions that Daniel has gives more and more and more information about what was to happen, especially now. We're right up to the end of this great Seleucid Empire. And we did talk about this before in other lessons, but so the Seleucid Empire, remember, covers Syria, Babylon, and Medo-Persia. So it goes off into the east. But they also ruled in Syria, which is in the northern part of modern day Israel, or Palestine, whichever you want to look at it as. It was called Palestinia in that day. The Romans had named it Palestinia, I believe. But nevertheless, we see that the Seleucid king, who rose to power toward the end of the time of the great four kingdoms, was Antiochus III, or Antiochus the Great. I guess they like to name themselves, and he's given himself the appellation the Great. He died in 187 BC. And what's interesting is that Antiochus went up against Rome. Remember, at this time, Rome was still in its phase of the Republic. And so at that time, there were battles going on, and Antiochus the Great actually went up and took some of the islands and areas to the south of Rome, and really infuriated the people of the Republic of Rome. And there was a peace pact made, and as part of the peace pact, Antiochus III agreed that he would stay in his lane. He would stay away from Rome. He wouldn't cross over into their territories, and that he would pay back half of the cost of the getting an army ready and sending the army forth to fight him. They never really fought, but Rome was looking for some compensation. They were looking to be compensated for all of the trouble that Antiochus III had put them to. Well, as I mentioned, Antiochus III eventually dies. He dies in 187 BC, and his son, his eldest son, Seleucus IV, also known as Philopater, um, takes over the kingdom, and he rules for a period of time to about 175 BC. And upon his death, Antiochus, of course, decides that he wants to take the kingdom. Another person takes the kingdom in the meantime, but it's not long, just a matter of months, that uh, Antiochus the Fourth comes down and takes the kingdom with help, of course, and gives himself the appellation Antiochus Epiphanes, um, talking about his view of himself as God in flesh. He really did feel that he was God come down to the earth. And so in that vein, Antiochus took the throne, and that he was the little horn of the vision that we saw in chapter 8. And he is like a I guess the best way would be to call it a prefiguring of the Antichrist that shall come. He prefigures that Antichrist, and rightly so, because in 187 or 167 BC, he conquered Jerusalem. He had tried to go back into Egypt again, and he was trying to really conquer the Ptolemaic kingdom down there. He had already been in once. He'd taken Alexandria, and the Romans, who really had control of that area and who looked after them, were involved in another war, and at the time weren't able to spare any people to come and worry about Alexandria. And so he stirred up the Romans, and as he came down again to try to reinstate his power, and make sure that his puppet king that he had put in place there was still loyal to him, uh, an ambassador from the Republic came and met him. And you remember I told you that story, how the ambassador came, and Antiochus Epiphanes knew the man. He had known him from his time in Rome. He had been a political prisoner there for a time, uh, and so um, he extended his hand, remember, to be kissed by the ambassador from Rome. And the ambassador from Rome made no attempt to kiss his hand and show fealty and show loyalty to him. But remember, I told you he drew a line in the sand around him. And he said, before you step out of this line, tell me what message to take back to the Senate in Rome. Are you going to be in opposition to Rome, or are you going to toe the line? And you recall how old Antiochus Epiphanes thought about it, and he was weighing up his options, and he decided to walk off and not go do anything in Egypt. And so he averted great destruction, of course, because Rome, I think, even in the time of the Republic, could have dealt great devastation. But on his way back, remember how he came to Jerusalem and he unleashed all of his anger and his hatred and his, he had been belittled and made to cower like a child and go back to his homeland. And he took all of that vengeance out in Jerusalem. Remember how he took away the sacrifice. He robbed the implements out of the temple. He set up an altar to Mars and offered sacrifices and polluted the temple, which was dedicated to God. In fact, he stood up in doing so against the Most High, who had set up this temple and who had caused it to be set up. And the temple wasn't destroyed, but it was most definitely defiled. And that happened in 167 BC. And it's funny how things work, because about 100 years later, or longer than that, 140 years later, 70 AD, well, no, it would be over 200 years later, that the Romans would, under Titus, a general, would destroy Jerusalem, would destroy the temple, would destroy the wall, and it would make it desolate. And it remains desolate unto this day. So we see in this little horn of the Seleucid Empire, at the end of these four kingdoms, one who would stand up to defy even the God of heaven. And of course, the Bible tells us that his end was without hand. That is, he wasn't killed in battle, but he died a most horrific death. That's for certain. And we talked about that before. And I'll read you this little excerpt that I've copied down. It says that this is Antiochus Epiphanes I'm talking about, being stricken with a violent disorder in his bowels, or in his guts, his body covered with worms, his flesh flaked off, and emitted such a stench as was intolerable even to his own army. So he died like so many would die, eaten of worms, and his flesh falling from his body. So it just shows you that God is in control. He sets up rulers for a purpose, and he pulls them down when their time is completed. Now, the discussion from verse 5 onward, we're not going to have time to read it tonight. We're now at 7:37, and I don't want to go too long, but I want to explain verses 5 through 29, and it actually goes a little bit beyond that, but I'm going to stop it at verse 29, because this is talking about that back and forth between this divided Grecian kingdom, and specifically between the Seleucid kings and the Ptolemaic kings who ruled in Egypt, right? So it's a back and forth, a fighting over this land, back and forth. And wouldn't you know it, that Israel would be right in the firing line, and that Jerusalem would be right on the line as well. And it would remain that way all of the time of these kings. And so the back and forth you see there from verse 5 straight on through verse 29 is talking about that time. And when we get to verse 30, and it talks about the ships of Chittim shall come against him, we're going to stop there, and we're going to take up this discussion from that time. So, and the important thing is to know that this is that time when Antiochus Epiphanes was repelled from attacking and defeating once again Egypt and Alexandria. That was his intention. And just before he vented his hatred and frustrations on the Jewish nation and on, of course, the temple itself. So we'll take up the story there next week. So you see how a lot of these things cover the same ground again and again. And if you were living in Daniel's day, you would be glad of such things, because it provided more and more detail on what was to come. So these were things for the children of Israel to look to and to look for in the events of history, and to know where they were in the great expanse of history. And in much the same way, we look back at them now. We look back at them as great confirmations of the wisdom and the perfect wisdom and power of God. And of course, it helps us too when we think of the book of Revelation, that the things in Daniel many of them have been fulfilled to the letter. There's still things unfulfilled there, of course, but we have every confidence that they'll be fulfilled and to the letter and perfectly, because it's God who's in charge of these things. So have a read through and those verses up through verse 29 and even into verse 30, and know that those ships of Chittim, talking about Rome and the Roman Republic, and their beginning to exert their influence on this area. And of course, the time of Rome was coming. Their time was already on the horizon and very close, as they had much power. And the Grecian kingdoms divided into four. Their power was waning away. And of course, soon the Caesars would arise, and a Caesar named Augustus, which was the one of the Bible who determined that all the world should be taxed in his day. So, my friends, we're coming right along in history, aren't we? We're right up now to nigh on to the birth of Christ. We're coming closer and closer to that time. So until next time, thank you for coming into the live tonight. And we want to invite you along to our services at Morayfield East State School. We meet there at 10 a.m. on Sunday morning, 5 p.m. on Sunday evening. In the mornings, we've just started a series of lessons in the parables. And we're going to be looking this week at the wise man and the foolish man, who built their houses, one on a rock and one on the sand, no foundation. And in the evening, we're doing a walkthrough of the tabernacle. We do have a handout that I'll bring in on Sunday morning. We're going to give these out to anyone who is unable to attend Sunday evening, so you can have our notes. There's not so many notes in this one as there are scriptures, but this coming Sunday night, we're going to do a walkthrough of the temple. And I mean by that, we're going to be able to see it and see some of the items, of course, representations of those items. And this will really start our study in the individual parts of it. We hope to see you there, 5 o'clock, if you want to be a part of that. And if you can't, then by all means, come back here and join us next Thursday night at 7 p.m. for our Thursday night live. And until next time, God bless you and keep you. And we look forward to seeing you next week. Good night.